Hello, U.S. history students. It's Mrs. Freeze here with you.
And Mr. Freeze, and today we are going to be talking about the Gilded Age. Now, before we get into the definition and explanation of what it means to be gilded, we first wanted to throw this person up on the screen there. And
let me start off by saying it is not Albert Einstein. Because most times, ninth graders, they all raise their hand, very confident that they know who this is, and they think it's Albert Einstein because of the kind of crazy hair, but it's not.
It's actually an American author who wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Some great books that I read back in English class in my day.
Absolutely.
Really good books.
Yeah. And if at this point you don't know who he is, he actually has two names, and this kind of fits right in with the idea of being gilded. If you notice here, this man is wearing a white suit. Nobody wears a white suit unless you're rich, especially at this point in history.
It's like a summer suit.
It is, but he really, by the time, very shortly after he had this picture taken, he would die in poverty without a dime to his name. But on the outside, he looks rich and successful. And if you haven't figured out who this is yet, his name is...
Can I tell them?
Sure, go ahead.
Mark Twain.
Now,
I bet some of you know it.
You might say that name. However, that was the name that he wanted people to know. He actually had a real name of Samuel Clemens, but he thought Mark Twain sounded much better. He is almost the epitome of the Gilded Age. And the reason why this time period is called the Gilded Age is because he coined the term. He came up with it. And gilded, which was coined by Mark Twain, a famous American author, meant anything that glitters on the surface but is rotten underneath. And you may not understand this yet, so let me give you a couple more examples of what gilded literally means here.
Like, ladies, if a gentleman ever gives you a piece of jewelry, like a ring or a bracelet or something, and it turns your finger green, it's not real gold. Gilded.
It's gilded. So you can gild anything. You can literally gild anything. You can gild an apple. You can coat it in gold or copper or whatever. And on the outside, it may have a thin layer of gold or copper, but underneath it is a rotten apple. My parents bronzed my baby shoes for some reason and turned them into bookends.
My grandparents did that to my mom's shoes.
Yeah, if you ever get back into school, I have it in school. You can actually see it. But underneath that thin layer of bronze, my students are always like, oh, is that really expensive? And I'm like, no, underneath it is leather. That's all there. So underneath all of this thin layer of shiny stuff is
rottenness. Sometimes you might feel like you know a person like that, someone who looks all shiny and nice on the surface, and then underneath they're really not so shiny.
You kind of hit that with Ellen, right?
On the talk show host. Ellen DeGeneres. I thought she was like the nicest, like most. She seemed like she could be anyone's best friend, and now I'm hearing that she's actually not
the surface,
so great.
We're learning all these dark stories.
Thanks for bringing that up.
No
Sore
problem.
Spot here.
So the metaphor that we're making here is that they're not saying, Mark Twain isn't saying, too many things are being gilded. What he's saying is
looking at the U.S. and he's saying, if you just look at us, like take a glance down Fifth Avenue where all like the nice mansions are, and you just look where like you see John Rockefeller walking around in his fancy clothes, it looks like, oh, wow, the U.S. has it made, like things are great. But when you really looked at the U.S., and if you looked closely, you would notice that a lot of that money was in the hands of a very few, but the vast majority of people were living not even a middle-class existence, lives of poverty, bad working conditions, low wages, long working hours, you had child labor. So we had a lot of problems that, if you didn't look, if you just looked where the rich people lived, you might not notice.
So look, at this point, to really drive this home, the much wealth, that's the glittering on the surface. However, underneath, that's all that rottenness, the poverty and the working conditions. And we actually had the opportunity to go up to Rhode Island a few years ago. And some of the mansions that are up there, if you were part of this wealth that was being produced and you were one of those monopolists like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, who we'll mention, you really didn't see much of this stuff. You didn't
Right.
have to. You could move away from it. But people, all they focused on was the wealth that was being produced, and much of this stuff, this poverty, was being ignored. In fact, a lot of people said it's okay to have very few wealthy people and everybody else be poor.
And if we have a chance in a later lesson, we'll show you where we went in Rhode Island. It's a place called Newport. And the thing back then was if you were a rich person in New York City and you wanted to escape the city in the summer because it got hot and it got smelly, you didn't go to the Jersey Shore. You went to Newport, Rhode Island. And these rich people, like the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, they would have these insanely large houses. They referred to them as their summer cottages, which in your mind, you might be thinking of a little tiny cottage. These things were enormous and they were expensive. And these people only used these houses for approximately 6 weeks out of the entire year. They were just their summer homes. And you needed a large staff to maintain these homes. And again, we'll show you pictures of that later.
In fact,
it's really interesting.
We'll attach it to this lesson. We'll put another link where you can check out some of the pictures that we got when we were there.
And none of these the houses that we went to, no one lives in them now, but they're preserved. So people, it's a part of history to see how these people lived. And they would have these extravagant parties at these homes, because part of the thing was the women of the house. It was always like you needed to have the nicest parties. You had to kind of like one up everyone, all the other women in the neighborhood. And just, they would do such extravagant things that I think when poor people read this stuff in the newspapers, they were like, wow, this woman just threw a birthday party for her dog and it costs, $500,000. That was more like these animals would eat better food than most Americans ate.
And you would say, is this okay? And there were people at the time who were saying, absolutely, yes, this is perfectly okay.
Usually the rich people said that.
English philosopher Herbert Spencer said, yes, this is perfectly okay. In fact, this is
normal.
This is normal. This is nature taking its course.
And you shouldn't try to interfere.
Right. Well, you should be laissez-faire. You guys have your hands up, right? All right.
I bet they do.
I hope they do. But it's social Darwinism was the term. And again, this is in red, guys. Social Darwinism, I know it sounds simple right now and not super important, but you're going to see what effect this has on America in a second and the rest of the world. Social Darwinism was the application of Darwin's theory of evolution to human society. Now, if you don't know what evolution is, evolution basically says that
you should learn about it in biology class.
Yeah, but it basically says that man started off as some type of primate or monkey chimpanzee and eventually over time evolved into a human being. And we can look to the animal kingdom for this as well. For example, my backyard is full of rabbits. And if I gave you a second here, if you want to pause right after this and just think in your heads about reasons why bunnies are so successful in my backyard. All right, go ahead and pause. We'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. All right, none of you pause, so I'm going to move on. But anyway, the rabbit, they're fast and they multiply. They breed like rabbits. They have multiple litters. They produce a lot of offspring. Every time I let my dog out the back and it tries to catch one, it has never ever been able to catch a rabbit as hard as it tries because they have evolved to be successful. In fact, remember when we found baby rabbits in our backyard and we took them to this place called the Ark up in Doylestown, and it's an animal shelter, and they said, you must have a dog in your backyard because these things have evolved to have their babies and their nest in the yards of people who own domesticated dogs.
And you might think that sounds odd. Like, why would you have your little baby rabbits where there's a dog that could hurt them? But this is something the rabbits learned over time, is that dog is not going to catch a rabbit, but that dog will ward off other predators that might catch a rabbit.
So these rabbits that have learned this pass on those genetics and those behaviors to future generations. This rabbit is fit to live in suburbia at this point, okay? However, this other little individual over here, known as the dodo bird, today is extinct. And if you've never seen a dodo bird, it's because they've never existed in your lifetime. The dodo bird was not fit to live in the society when society began changing. And what I mean by that is they basically evolved on these islands free from any predators. And when settlers landed on these islands, the dodo birds had no fight or flight response. In fact, they were curious. So when the settlers get off, and explorers get off their boats on these islands, the dodo birds pretty much approach them like, hi.
Like a dodo.
Like a dodo. That's why it's called, if you're a dodo, you're kind of a dunce. You're stupid. And the dodo birds, they just grab them by the neck, ring them up, cut their heads off. And the other birds would just be like, oh, hi. And they didn't move. And there was no fight or flight response. And because of that,
they didn't evolve over time. They didn't learn these new, their behaviors never changed. So they will go extinct. Whereas the rabbit is still around.
And not only that, these settlers brought dogs too. And they brought rats on their ships. And the rats ate their eggs and they never evolved. They couldn't change quickly enough to the environment. Now, this guy went extinct. And this guy is still really successful today. Now, what Herbert Spencer is doing is he's saying...
And let's just also point out, Charles Darwin, who in your science class you'll learn about with evolution, and what Mr. Freeze was really just talking about there was natural selection. The strong survive, the weak die off. Charles Darwin solely applied that to the animal kingdom. He was not talking about like rich people versus poor people. He talked about this is how animals change and evolve, and here's how they survive and how some don't.
But Herbert Spencer says, let's apply this to mankind because we're just basically animals with really tricked out brains. And so he says, look, if you don't have competition in which the weak fall and the strong survive, society can never evolve. So what we need to do is we need to allow people with really strong traits that have allowed them to be successful to breed, and to pass those traits on, and to let poor people
just kind of die off. Like, for example, and this is not nice, and we would not agree with this now, but he would say, don't go around to poor neighborhoods and vaccinate people. Like, let the strong survive and the weak die off, and that's how you end up with a stronger overall society.
Yeah, in fact, the term survival of the fittest, a lot of people attribute that to Darwin. Darwin never said that. Herbert Spencer said the survival of the fittest is really how nature should work here. And he said, look, it's not just natural selection, it's survival of the fittest. And John D. Rockefeller, you can see how he adopts some of these ideas of Herbert Spencer. He actually says, the American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance, which bring cheer to its beholder. So he's saying, look, America, beautiful America, can only be beautiful when sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it. I hope you know what he's talking about. You want to explain what he means when he says the early buds?
Yeah, he's talking about, like, not the people like him, not the rich and successful. He's talking about your poorer people, your immigrants, like the people that were on the lower rungs of society. And again, this isn't something that I would walk around saying, because it's a pretty callous, just not nice way to look at society. But again, if you're the rich guy at the top, it's very convenient to hear a guy like Herbert Spencer and then be able to say, yes, I'm successful because I have survived because I'm the strongest, and everyone around the rest of me should just fall down to the ground, and that's how society, improves. And
he even goes on
and convenient when you're at the top.
He says this is not an evil tendency in business. He's like, I'm not evil.
This is just how it is. It is what it is.
It's a law of nature and a law of God. So if you're a little business or you're a worker, he's saying, look, if we need to kill off that business, or if you're an immigrant and you can't cut it and you're starving, I'm sorry, that's tough. It's just a law of nature and a law of God. People like me should be the ones at the top of society, and we should do nothing to help out these early buds because they'll just drag down society, these small businesses, these poor workers. So why is it important? Well, to bring this all to a conclusion here, it was used to justify U.S. health policy, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Laws limiting immigration that we'll see in the 1920s. These people are considered less than. and the US taking over poorer countries. And we will get to World War II and Adolf Hitler eventually. But these ideas of people being less than because of their
Where
race,
they're from,
their color of their skin,
their level of education.
Absolutely. This was not just Nazi type idea. These ideas were floating around the United States, were floating around Great Britain. In fact, children who were poor were known as gutter children, idiots.
Like idiots was like a technical term back then. Like a mental health physician could talk to someone and assess them, and that would be their diagnosis. Idiot. Like today, sometimes you may call your friend that as just teasing, but
same thing with moron. A moron
right.
was a level of stupidity that could lead to you actually being, well, let me get to it right now. You could be sterilized for being an idiot or a moron. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case.
And it wasn't voluntary. And let's first explain what it means to sterilize someone. It's when you take away their ability to reproduce. Like a lot of us do this to our pets at home. And when we get to Nazi Germany, we'll learn about how that was a very common thing there. There were certain people they did not want to be able to reproduce, but they actually got a lot of those ideas from things that they saw here.
Yeah, because this is the United States. We're not talking about Nazi Germany. We're talking about the United States, the beginning of the 1900s. A Supreme Court case in 1924, Buck versus Bell, there was actually a ruling that said 3 generations of idiots is enough. And they actually sterilized a woman who...
What was her name? Carrie Buck, I think. If you listen to this this interview that Mr. Freeze put in here, I remember listening to this. It was really, really interesting, but also very sad. And a lot of times what would happen, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, what happened in this woman's case was she had actually been, I think, sexually assaulted by someone in the family. And then instead of the family just admitting that had happened, they classified her as kind of this woman of loose morals and an idiot and this and that. And they ended up taking away her ability to reproduce. It was a long time ago I listened to this. I'm going to have to listen to it again.
But not only that, the repercussions of just this woman's case led to 70,000 forced sterilizations in the United States. And so this whole idea of social Darwinism was not only used to justify putting small businesses that weren't doing so well out of business and being bought out, it was also used at an individual level to force the sterilization of people who are deemed idiots. And at that point, if you didn't speak English, that might be enough for a doctor to be like, wow, this person's a poor person who can't speak well.
And even people who did speak English, if you just weren't well educated, which a lot of people weren't, you were in danger of labels like this. And it's kind of odd to think that we used to do this to people. It seems very un-American, but some history is not always pleasant.
So to wrap this up, guys, if you ever need to access any of our PowerPoints, we not only leave a Screencastify for you guys with our input on the lesson,
but we also give you a link to the actual Google slide. And that way, if you want to go back, oftentimes we have links inserted, and in the Screencastify, we will make sure to call your attention to those links. And if you ever want to go back, sometimes it's a short video. This is an actual something that was on the radio. So yeah.
But if it's something you're interested in, or if you're in another class and you're like, wow, I remember we learned about this in U.S. history, I want to go back and learn more about it or do some research, these will be here for you. But that is our lesson for today. The next part of this is going to focus on what's known as child labor. So you're going to be looking at some primary sources that revolve around someone who is going to be known as a progressive or a reformer, somebody who will try to make changes for the better. And that will be a man by the name of Lewis Hine. So you guys are going to do an activity with that. Should be pretty eye-opening for you and pretty enjoyable activity. Have fun with it, and we will see you guys for the next lesson.
Bye-bye.